Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God.
Welcome to day 2 of the virtual mission trip. Our theme for tonight is, what is life like on the reservation? We will explain the history of the Lakota Sioux and the reservation on Pine Ridge. We will hear from Lakota believers firsthand. And we'll listen to stories from the Way Church missionaries who have made this trip in the past. Our intention for this segment is to explain the challenges in this particular mission field, as well as the hope we have in Jesus in penetrating the area with the good news. The Lakota are one of 3 sub-bands of the Sioux people, and there are 7 sub-tribes within the Lakota. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were both notable Lakota. The massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890, where over 250 unarmed Lakota men, women, and children were killed, brought an end to the warfare between the U.S. government and this tribe. The site of this massacre is inside the Pine Ridge Reservation and is the source of bad feelings toward the white man to this day. The Pine Ridge Reservation is the home of the Oglala Lakota Sioux. The Native Americans residing on the Pine Ridge Reservation face enormous challenges. They have the shortest life expectancy in the Western Hemisphere, the highest unemployment in North America, and excessively high rates of suicide and infant mortality. It is worth noting that missionaries have been coming to Pine Ridge for decades, and while it could be said that their intentions were well-meaning, the results have sometimes been questionable. Each spring, as the weather begins to clear, Lakota leaders will often distribute information that is meant to remind the people on Pine Ridge Reservation to be wary of aggressive, proselytizing, and demeaning treatment of Lakota spirituality and language, baptizing children without parental permission, use of humiliating poverty photos to help fundraise, and of forwarding an agenda that pushes non-native values and goals. Some members have made allegations of sexual abuse and financial misdeeds and point to the failure of most organizations to conduct background checks for their workers and volunteers. Pine Ridge has become one of the top destinations for evangelical Christian churches and charities, and it is often referred to that the people that show up there on a weekly basis are the white van people, due to the habit of renting those white utility vans, and the weekly arrivals just tend to come in waves. It's also very important to note that the Lakota people are very relational, and that means that they need to have a relationship with you before a level of trust can be earned. They don't respond well to aggressive white Americans that tend to behave in a transactional way. They're a proud culture, and they don't respond well to being pitied or to be spoken of as though their heritage is some sort of mistake that needs to be fixed. I know at this point you're probably thinking, hey, sign me up. What a wonderful place for me to go to learn how to evangelize in a mission field. I get that, but it is very important that we understand the people in the culture before we go anywhere to share the gospel. You know, Paul explains this very clearly, actually, in 1 Corinthians 9. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak, to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. This applies to us whether we are sharing the gospel in Pine Ridge or to our neighbor down the street. Our first trip had many benefits, including a couple seasoned missionaries in our team, plus the patient instruction of Wade McCarg. He had us start out each morning with 2 to 4 hours of intense prayer, worship, and training. He would tell us what we were doing, why we were doing it, and what to expect from the people. Wade also introduced us to some of the other missionaries that were living in Pine Ridge so that we could see what else God was doing on the reservation. And by the time we set out to perform what I would call street evangelism, we were about as equipped as we could possibly be. So we set out 2 by 2 in the small, dusty town of Kyle on the Pine Ridge Reservation to hand out cans of coffee, which is a sign of welcome to the Lakota people, and to offer prayer. It was at least 100 degrees of stifling heat, and there was really no shade to be found anywhere. The houses were scattered trailer units, mostly unmaintained and with various levels of debris surrounding everything. What passed as a street was a rutted, packed dirt stretch that was bordered by more packed dirt and tumbleweeds. So with that setting, Monica and I set out, but we were a little afraid of how we would be received. But that really quickly turned into utter fright as we walked into the center of this area and were immediately approached by a pack of wild dogs. Now might be a good time to mention prayer. And so we did, loudly. And what would become the first of many moments when we felt that God said, "Don't worry, I got this." The dogs merely sniffed and retreated. So at that point, we were pretty much overwhelmed with a sense of peace and confidence, and went about going door to door, knocking on each of the doors. No prayer was refused. God's presence, God's Spirit preceded us. We we became blind to fear, and instead became more excited about God's love and couldn't wait to find the next person. You know, it was in that moment, in that place, that God reminded me of His presence, His continual presence, something that I hadn't really felt to that degree in Centennial, Colorado. But when you get to a situation like that on the mission field, God can really show up. So, are the lost any more lost in Pine Ridge than those who don't know the Lord in Centennial? No, of course not. But were there more palpable spirits of the enemy on the Pine Ridge Reservation? It certainly felt that way to me. But the Spirit of God is infinitely more powerful. And once you've experienced that power, by becoming weak and vulnerable and calling upon the name of the Lord, there's no turning back. My faith had never been more tested, nor never been more fulfilled than that first mission trip to Pine Ridge.
Be still